I'm Marika from My Creative Quilts, and I'm doing another short video for you on preparing your top for quilting. Whether you do the quilting yourself, machine, hand, or long arm, or you're sending the quilt out to be done by somebody else, you need to take a few steps to make sure your top is at its best for quilting. That will optimize how the quilting will look in the end. Squaring is an important part of it, so I'll be doing that in a different video. Other than squaring up your quilt, there are a few other things you need to do. First, you have to make sure that it's pressed. Okay, you want the majority of the creases out. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just need the strongest creases out. The rest will come out through the quilting process. You don't iron. You don't go back and forth on the, you press. You literally press. And that's because you don't want to distort the seams if you have a pieced quilt, and you don't want to distort the whole thing, especially once it's all squared. Because sometimes I'll press before I square and then I'll have to press again after I square because there's been a long time in between. So just make sure you do that properly. Okay, one of the problems that we have with quilts that have a lot of seams along the edges is they can separate during the quilting process. When you're doing piecing, especially when you're doing chain piecing, you won't always have back stitching at the beginning, at the end of the seam, and that's what will hold the quilt in place. Or you may have back stitched at the end, but when you've squared off the quilt, you've cut off those anchoring stitches. So then when you start quilting later, you end up with, sorry, I'm just looking for the edge here, seams that are separating because there's nothing holding them down. So what I do when I have a lot of seams on a quilt, I will stay stitch it. Okay, you can see, I don't know if you can see the stitching there. I'll just stay stitch a big stitch. I think this one was set at 5, so it's my basting stitch on my sewing machine. And I just quickly go along and I stay stitch because if you look, there's a couple of places where you can see the seam was starting to separate. Here we go. There's one that's starting to separate, but the stay stitching keeps it from going on. Because what happens when you're quilting, you're moving it around on the machine or on your lap, and you're pulling on it, and this all becomes separated. I've had a few instances where it's gone down as much as an inch, and I've had to resew it. Sometimes I do it by hand, sometimes I do it by machine. But stay stitching keeps that from happening. So this border that I had put on, I did do the anchor stitching, but like I said, when I squared it, the anchor stitch got cut off. So that's where the stay stitching is important. This quilt, I didn't have to worry about too much because it's all border along the edges. So I back stitched, and because I was able to cut it, trim it, and not lose my anchor stitching, I didn't have to worry about stay stitching it. But if I was concerned, I would just do that one seam and also where the border was sewn together because it wasn't quite long enough. I don't see it here right now, but I will also do it because of that. And then of course there's the whole cloth type of quilt. This is not technically it's technically a whole cloth because it's one piece. And see that you don't need to do anything about it. It's one that I appliqued and still needs to be quilted. So you just make sure it's square and pressed and it's ready to go. So that's my short video on making sure that your seams stay put when you're trying to quilt it, and I hope it was helpful.